Thank you for tuning into this video about the Mexican political institutions. Now, in our last video, we talked about Mexico's history, and certainly that plays a role in establishing the institutions that we have in Mexico. But when I talk about Mexico, I always think it's important to realize that in many ways, it's very similar to the United States. We have a federalist system in Mexico, very similar to the system used in the United States. We have a presidential system, very similar to that existing in the US. It has a bicameral legislature, and it has a judicial branch, a Supreme Court. All very similar, but Mexico has kind of a unique twist on a lot of those political institutions. Some of it, because of its history, has created a unique twist on those institutions. Let's start with some of the basics. In the history unit, we talked about, how Mexico has transitioned to a democracy. Really, over the last 20, 30 years, it's become more democratic each and every single term. It certainly is a country that has newly industrialized. It's not a country that industrialized like over 100 years ago. It's relatively new. In fact, it's been growing in wealth really since the NAFTA agreement of the 90s. We have a federalist system with states, and we have a bicameral legislature with a presidential system, which is very different from the previous countries we've talked about. We've talked about the UK and their parliamentary system. We talked about Russia and their semi-presidential system. We've talked about China and their one-party state, that it doesn't really matter what their system is. They're kind of semi-presidential on the surface, but here we have a country that is presidential by nature. So they've centered the head of state and the head of government into one position. Also, in Mexico, they have a strong corporatist tradition. They have a strong spoils system, very similar to what the US had, with a lot of patronage going on and a lot of patronage controlled by the presidency. And also, they're multi-party, as in they've had, two or three parties really over the last 30 years that have all kind of had a chance to win the presidency and win seats in government. They had a one-party state. So they're a country that transitioned from a one-party state into a multi-party state. Whereas Russia is still kind of stuck in the one-party dominance, and China is stuck in one-party control via the Constitution. Now let's start by looking at federalism. They do have 31 different states, and each of those states does have a governor, very similar to the United States. Each of those governors serves 6-year terms, but cannot run for governor again. Mexico has a long-standing tradition of when you get elected, you are there with one term or 2 terms or no consecutive terms. They have a lot of limitations on terms. And this, you know, in the US, we talk a lot about term limits and potential term limits for Congress, and when they establish term limits for the presidency as a way to cut back on corruption, cut back on people being professional politicians for their entire life, try to get some common folk in there as politicians. But having no term limits can have, or having term limits like this can have negative consequences because you might you know, be more corrupt as a leader, as in you might take bribes and all that stuff because who cares? You're not running for re-election, but you also might take positive risks. So there are kind of pros and cons of not having a second term. You can take risks that help out the people. You can take risks that offend the elites. But also, you could completely bend to the will of the elites, and it doesn't really matter because you're not running for re-election again. Now, if you're a governor and you get elected once, you might want to run for president someday. So you still might want to do great things for your state. And that might keep you in check a little bit. Plus, if you're not, like maintaining rule of law in your state, the president and the Senate could theoretically remove you from power and appoint someone to fill in. Let's talk about the president. The president, of course, is the head of state and head of government in Mexico. So both the representative of Mexico as well as the leader of the government. And the executive branch in Mexico doesn't have a vice president. If the president were to be incapacitated or quit or die, they would just appoint an interim president to fill in. So the legislature would replace them for the time being with somebody else. No vice presidents needed in the Mexico presidential system. The current president is Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, also known as Obrador or AMLO, because his name is rather lengthy. The news media tends to use AMLO, so if you search AMLO or if you use AMLO in an FRQ, that'll be perfectly fine. You could also just refer to him as Obrador, which is his last name. So he'll be serving out a 6-year term. He can only run for one 6-year term, and that'll expire in 2024. Once again, this has the pros and cons of, of risk, that you're not running for reelection, so you don't have to appease the voters. You don't have to appease the elites. You don't have to appease corporations. You can do whatever you promise to do in the big scheme of things, or you could do none of that, and you don't have to worry about reelection. It doesn't matter at all. You are, of course, elected by first past the post. So we have seen a lot of elections where, you're getting 1/3 of the vote, or you're getting 40% of the vote, because there are such, different. We've had three major parties in Mexico for a good time being. It's resulted in, a minority vote getting the presidency. And there's no runoffs or anything like that, so it's not like the Russia system. Russia uses first past the post, but remember, Russia also has absolute majority, so if you don't get a majority, you have to go into a runoff. Not the case here. Also, by tradition, under the PRI, which of course was that one party state dominant party, they used to choose the next president. The president got to kind of handpick their successor. Of course, that doesn't happen today, where parties are a lot more competitive. Here is not the 2018 election, but the 2012 election, just to show you how divided this could be. Here, with 38% of the vote, Enrique Peña Nieto won. And you see Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, came in second that year. He also ran back in 2006. So he's been running the last three presidential elections and finally won in 2018 with like 54% of the vote. So a majority of the vote actually voted for AMLO. He's a very populist candidate, trying to represent the people as best he can, and end corruption is his big platform issue. Now, the executive in Mexico is extremely powerful. We're talking about a president that is able to introduce bills in the legislature. We're talking about a president that is able to issue laws by decree. And that's just on top of, being able to create government agencies and then all the other stuff that a president typically has. Remember, presidents typically can veto legislation, they can name cabinet members, they can fire cabinet members, they can grant pardons. But on top of that, AMLO has even more power. In the US, the president can't introduce bills. In the US, the president can't just make government agencies. In the US, the president can't just make law by decree. And in the US, the president doesn't have a patronage system to utilize. So in Mexico, it's extremely powerful to be president. You can make government agencies to respond to whatever issue you want. You can appoint people to those positions. You can, appoint your supporters through patronage. You can give out contracts via patronage, and you can introduce your own bills. That's just unheard of amounts of power here. Some would say it's similar in power to the presidency in Russia and Putin, but I'd say that AMLO can't necessarily wage war as easily as Putin can, whereas AMLO can certainly change things up domestically at a pretty powerful rate by controlling patronage, by controlling government agencies, and by making policy by decree as opposed to the typical legislative process. And remember, decrees are a lot more powerful than an executive order. An executive order in the US is utilizing the bureaucracy and already established law, and a decree doesn't have to worry about any established laws. So you have some similarities and differences between Russia and Mexico that I always like to point out. If you have time, pause this and look this over, as there's some great connections here and differences between Russia and Mexico. Okay, the executive also does control the bureaucracy, which once again I said uses a lot of patronage. And if you don't know what patronage is, think the spoils system in the United States, where you had businesses and people supporting politicians because they would get benefits in return. They would get contracts, they would get jobs, they would get posts in the bureaucracy. That exists in Mexico still to this day. Mexico also has gigantic government owned corporations, and in particular, the one that a lot of people focus in on is called Pemex. And a government owned corporation is what's typically called a parastatal when you're looking at it from a political science standpoint. So, parastatals are government owned corporations. Think like the US Postal Service or Amtrak. Those are parastatals in the United States. But Mexico has their oil industry controlled by the Mexican government. This allows for them to profit off of oil. It also allows for them to dominate oil in Mexico. Other industries, other companies aren't able to own the oil, the petroleum in Mexico. And it allows for Mexico to be, a large supplier of oil and, use that money from the oil industry to support investing in things the government wants, investing in things the people want, and investing more into that spoil system, which kind of gets linked to corruption. If you think patronage and spoil system and this corporatist philosophy, a lot of this is very corrupt from the international perspective. Now let's look at the legislature. The legislature is, two houses, the Chamber of Deputies, which is the lower house. The lower house has a mixed election structure, so you have some single member districts, you have some PR districts, and you have limitations on how many consecutive terms you can run for office. There are some term limits here for the people in the Chamber of Deputies. They do get elected every 3 years. So if you think about a president, when a president is elected in Mexico, the entire Chamber of Deputies is also elected during that time. Now, the Senate is the upper house. So you got a Chamber of Deputies and you have the Senate, kind of similar to the House of Reps and the Senate in the United States. The Senate in Mexico is elected for 6-year terms. So when AMLO was elected, so was the Senate and so was the Chamber of Deputies. So that means he brought in a lot of people with him that supported him. You can now run for 2 consecutive terms. There are term limits on the Senate as well, but it's not no consecutive terms like it used to be. And the Senate is elected in a different way. Each state has 3 senators. And what happens is each party puts forward 2 people in each of those states. So imagine a ballot where it says the 3 major parties and it has 2 names under each of them. And let's say Morena wins. Morena will get 2 of the 3 senator seats from that state. And the third seat will go to whichever party came in second in that state. So let's say it's the PRI, they're going to get one of the seats from that state. And this guarantees that the minority parties are able to have more say. It guarantees that the minority parties are going to get elected in the Senate. So it's another way of kind of protecting the minority in Mexico. Let's talk about the judiciary. I think the judiciary is kind of fascinating in many ways. Unlike Russia and the UK, the judiciary in Mexico uses code law, which means they look specifically on what the wordage says in the Constitution and what the laws say by word. This means they don't build up precedent like happens in many other countries. They don't use common law to establish um, new case law, essentially. So you don't see monumental court cases that establish new rights. You don't see monumental court cases that interpret things differently. In all actuality, when you have a court case, it can strike down a law, but it's not likely to have long-lasting changes to um, understanding of how law is in Mexico. Like, for example, in the US, we have a series of court cases that establish the right to privacy, like Roe v. Wade and Griswold versus Connecticut. But in Mexico, they wouldn't be able to establish a right to privacy unless it's said specifically in the Constitution or specifically in the law that you have a right to privacy. So they may have judicial review, but it's not really knocking down, it's not really changing what is there written on paper. You have to have those rights on paper. So, like having something in your constitution that's like equal protection of the law, that's very, very vague. And And Mexico really wouldn't have that because it'd be difficult to interpret for the courts. Another interesting thing about the Supreme Court in Mexico is they do have life terms, which does allow for more independence of the courts. They're relatively independent, but the catch is it has become kind of a tradition under the PRI, which controlled most of Mexico through all of its history, that the justices just resign when there's a new president. So it allows for the president to pick six, I mean not six new justices, but new justices for the next 6 years. This has kind of started to fade away, where you have justices that are not resigning, and it allows for more of an independent judiciary if they don't resign. They shouldn't feel pressured to remove themselves. The third interesting thing about Mexico's judiciary is the amparo, which is also known as the writ of protection. Let's say the legislature and the president pass a new law, and you think that law is unconstitutional. In Mexico, you're able to essentially petition to have that law suspended. And you send off this writ of protection, this amparo, to the Supreme Court, and they can suspend a law until they have a chance to review it. So it's protecting the people from potentially unfair and unconstitutional and unjust laws. And we've seen about a third of the writs of protections have resulted in suspended laws. So it's a good chance that you could see, the common people, the average citizen in Mexico is able to essentially get something reviewed by the Supreme Court relatively quickly and suspend it until that can be fully reviewed. It's a pretty powerful protection for the people. And lastly, I like to point out that just recently, Mexico has instituted what are called oral trials, which you're already familiar with in the United States. Whenever you see a court trial in the US, it has like a jury and it has a judge, and you have objections and you have people taking the witness stand. But imagine all of that didn't exist. Before 2008, when you had a criminal case or a civil case, you submitted everything in writing. All the testimony from witnesses, all the testimony from suspects, all of that was submitted in writing. None of it was given verbally. There was no chance for objections, and the judge reviewed it all and decided your fate. That doesn't have a whole lot of transparency. So in 2008, they started out basically having oral trials, which are the traditional trials that we have in the United States, where everything is transparent and you can kind of see what the court is doing. All these things are kind of protecting the people in many ways. It allows for a more independent judiciary. It allows for a more transparent judiciary. It allows for a more democratic system. And that's good points you could use if you're talking about democracy in Mexico. Let's talk about the military quickly here. The military is civilian controlled. That means that the secretaries in the cabinet that are in charge of the military are civilians. They're not generals. This is something the United States does as well. The Secretary of Defense is a civilian, not a general. And the interesting thing about Mexico's military is they do have an extensive military, but it's all used for domestic events. It's used to help control protests. It's used to root out corruption in the Mexico City police. It's used to break up a labor strike. It's used to help people when there's an earthquake. It's used to combat the drug trafficking. It's used most recently to monitor and control caravans of people coming from Central America and trying to get access or refuge in the United States. So it's used for a lot of different stuff that are domestic, not used for like warfare with other countries. In fact, it'd be difficult for me to stretch my brain and try to think about an event in which Mexico went to war with someone else, because I can't think of a time where Mexico really went to war. Last thing I'll talk about is electoral reforms. Mexico has made a lot of changes in the 90s to make elections more democratic, and this has resulted in the PRI losing more power, which we've already kind of talked about. So, for example, um, they got rid of essentially campaign finance issues by saying that all parties receive government funding and all parties get equal access to the media. This is establishing a fairer playing field for all political parties, not just the PRI. They have added in foreign electoral observers, which is kind of the big step when you become more democratic. You invite other countries to come watch your elections. And this allows for you to show the world that your elections are now free and fair. If you want to become seen as more of a liberal democracy, if you want to be seen as an equal to the other major democracies on the planet, you want to showcase that your democracy is actually a democracy. And part of that, they instituted was what is called the Federal Electoral Institute, which is helping the states to run elections. It's helping to make the elections nationwide following the same structure, the same kind of ballots. It's trying to make sure that the elections are all free and fair and that funding is being evenly distributed. It's trying to make all of that better. A few other things, they did adjust the threshold for participation in the PR seats to 2%. They did open up suffrage to priests, so they allow priests to vote finally. If you recall, when the Constitution was written, there was some anti-clericalism where they basically made it so priests could not vote or participate in politics. And lastly, they started requiring that when you put together who's running for office in your in the Congress, your party has to have 40% women on the ballot. So trying to encourage more female representation, and Mexico's moved towards the top of countries that have women in their legislature. A lot more women, very similar to what we see in, China or the UK, where women are much more involved in politics. Oh, and I do have one more slide here about the media. I would just say that, under the PRI, under that one party rule before the 90s created a lot of reform, the media was pretty well controlled. And today, the media is kind of the Wild West. There's a lot more independent media. There's a lot more media from the United States. In fact, you'd probably say that people in Mexico can access a lot of the same stuff that people in the US can access. They have satellite television, they have ESPN, they have all these channels that are catering to a new audience in Mexico that are really from the United States. And that's creating more independent media, that's creating more media that's not controlled by the government, and that's all good for democracy too. Now, one issue with the media is that the cartels are difficult to have like investigative journalism around because a number of journalists have been killed or pressured to stop investigating things that involve the cartels. This is also another dangerous country for media, especially when they're investigating cartel action. Whereas Russia, it's maybe dangerous to be in the media if you're investigating the government. Okay, we're going to stop here. And we will stay tuned to the next video to talk about Mexican political culture. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.